Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to bring you the Castle Nathria, the Season 1 of Shadowlands raid healer tier list, what I think are going to be the top healers, and what I think the raid healer meta in general is just going to be looking like for Castle Nathria. So let's have a couple of asterisks before we get started. For number one, just because you be playing what would end up being at the bottom of the healer tier list doesn't mean that it's just impossible to bring, that it's garbage, whatever. We're talking about the most serious, the most hardcore of environments, what is going to be the best options for these guilds. And secondly, let's start talking about the differences in terms of what each healer brings. Because there's the raw throughput they bring, there's the utility they bring, and there's the passive or more or less passive damage that are brought. Now these always vary in value depending on what kind of fights there are. You know, back in the day when Resto Druid had moving trank, it's more or less valuable because of how different fights appear, right? You know, makes sense. But I want to stress this because there's been a number of misconceptions about how healer damage is going to be represented in the new tier, because that's one thing that came to a special prominence in the Eternal Palace, where really high passive healer damage and damage reduction became a perfect storm for Disc Priest Paladin, dominating the tier. As you go into the Castle Nathria, it's the beginning of an expansion, so throughput's going to be a lot more valuable. The damage is often more spread out and more elongated, so rather than one big burst that damage reduction covers, there's going to be a lot more opportunities for throughput to shine. And as a result, let's get ourselves started with the tier list with the number one slot, and it's going to be Resto Shaman. Resto Shaman actually is the only healer that I would say that you would be stacking two of for multiple different encounters to be able to get yourself a very, very large advantage. Some of the other healers that we'll talk about, there's some fights where you could, but I think Resto Shaman brings the most advantages possible to stack two of them throughout most of the encounters during raid progression. Pretty much every fight you can be stacked. You're not going to be having a lot of situations, for example, like you saw with like Il'gynoth, for example, where everybody's just spread out all over the place and taking so much damage that you're not going to have chain heal to bounce or anything along those lines. Shaman just does exceptionally well on every single raid test that we've done, and I've done every single raid test from normal, heroic, and mythic, and Resto Shaman was always something that not only had the throughput, but also had a lot of good areas for their utility to shine. Now, most importantly, it's going to be Stone Legion Generals and Sire Denathrius that we really need to look at, and we really need to sort of brainstorm as to what will be our best options. When it comes to Stone Legion Generals, there's a Heart Rend that goes out, but you put these absolutely massive debuffs out onto the party, and well, if you're having 4 of those debuffs ticking at once for a quarter of somebody's health pool every tick, having multiple chain heals spams to be able to cleave heal all these different people, or dispelling everything at once and taking advantage of a Spirit Link Totem or even Ankh Totem or something to back people up. There's just so many different advantages that you're able to have with a shaman in the group. A lot of times you're going to be having some movement on encounters, but just enough that Spearwalker's Grace really starts kicking in and becomes more noticeable. And Resto Shaman, while it doesn't have phenomenal healer DPS, if we're having more fights like we're seeing like Stone Legion, as I mentioned, where there's huge healer pressure for very specific windows in time, then Resto Shaman has decent damage. It's not as high as a Disc Priest by any means, but you're not as worried about having the highest healer damage possible because there's things that are pushing you and pressuring you into just muscling through mechanics via healing, right? And that's why I think Resto Shaman is that number one spot. And following it, shouldn't be a surprise, it's gonna be Disc Priest. Now Disc Priest, we actually stacked double disc for a lot of our healer testing, and I'd say there's a number of fights where it was favorable, but some of them, especially as we got later into the instance, I didn't think it was quite as necessary. And I think that, again, like I mentioned, it could be more advantageous to have that second shaman or another healer that's gonna come in and provide a bit more tank throughput as well. In Castle Nathria, there's a lot of tank pressure that's going to be going into the instance, and while this can offer good support, like I mentioned, having 2 of them might put your tanks at a bit bigger of a risk compared to bringing somebody that's more well suited for that. In terms of stacked encounters, like I just mentioned, plenty of good opportunities for barrier. A lot of the mechanics will have more pulsing damage rather than one big burst, but that's still fair enough for Disc because you're also going to be having Legendary extending the duration of your atonements that you cast during Rapture. So that's going to be able to help you deal with more steady damage. Of course, Evangelism's still going to be there, helping you deal with any of that steady damage going out, and your healer damage is always going to be quite valuable. So Disc does almost as much damage as most of the tanks. Obviously not like Prop Paladin. Prop Paladin's insane, but Disc does a crazy amount of damage, has that great utility with Barrier, has everything that we have expected Disc to bring to the table since like 7.25 when they had their facelift. So Disc, absolutely going to be in that S tier slot. Third place, now let me, a little addendum on this one. All of the healers on A could be moved up to S or down to B, and I'll talk about that first, all right? So either of the healers on the A list are more susceptible to buffs and nerfs or changes that I'll be going over, so I think that they could move in either direction, but how they stand if the expansion launched today and didn't have any changes is what I'm going to talk about. So, Mistweaver is third place. I know, it's weird. But Mistweaver has had a phenomenal time testing with Bone Dust Brew because of the really weird interactions that it's able to have, acting as if it had Renewing Mist on every single player that's affected. If that turns out to not be intended, and the reason I say that is because Bone Dust Brew has gone through like 5 months of not getting changed whatsoever and no comment whatsoever on it. So if it, by some miracle, were to make it through those tuning passes, it would offer ridiculous efficiency on a 1-minute cooldown to a lot of abilities, further pushing Mistweaver into this excellent single target and cleave healer scenario, which is also still really favorable to shamans as well. Like I mentioned, when you have some of these large overwhelming debuffs that you have coming out, Mistweaver can really heavily focus and drill down on them. Tank pressure is exceptionally high because they continuously are nerfing tanks throughout beta right now and making them take a crazy amount of damage, and having that extra spot healing resource is really good. Now, some of the downsides that are coming into it is that you wouldn't be having any damage reduction tools at your disposal, to which, as I mentioned, throughput is going to be increasingly valuable at the beginning of expansions, allowing a window for Mistweaver to succeed. The other downside is that Mistweaver has terrible passive damage. But again, that is going to be more or less valuable depending on the encounters. While healer damage is always good, it is more important depending on the encounter. It's more important depending on some of the tuning. Like I mentioned, healer damage is insanely important in Eternal Palace, and while it was valuable in Nyalotha, Corruption really just destroyed any chances of having some hard damage checks that needed every single healer muscling out damage just to be able to survive, right? That's the point I'm trying to make on that one. So, with Mistweaver having the potential, with Bone Dust Brew staying put, that could be really strong. Fallen Order for the Venthyr could be a really strong substitute if Bone Dust Brew gets nerfed and taken down, although it does make their healing just a bit less efficient. You just have this one big 3-minute meaty cooldown to be able to work with otherwise. But I think Mistweaver does have the throughput needed. It does have the right type of throughput in terms of heavy focused healing to be able to make a very big impact in Castle Nathria if people level it and if people start giving it a chance, especially during Heroic Week. It also is going to bring us to number 4 on our list, which is Holy Paladin. And yes, I put Mistweaver ahead of Holy Paladin because I've really not been that impressed with the spec at all. Throughout Castle Nathria testing, Holy Paladin's kind of just considerably lagged behind, and partially it's been due to healers figuring out the most optimal way to be playing Holy Pally and the most optimal way to figure that out. I'd say through some of the logs I've seen, it's been mostly mixed results. They've kind of jumped between all the covenants across the board, well, except for like Necrolord, to just be able to figure out what might be the best option. It's always kind of flipped based on a lot of the tuning that's been happening, but it seems like by and large Holy Paladin didn't quite bring as much throughput into areas. 1, overall, and 2, in a single target format. A lot of times when you're looking at priority healing, especially onto specific debuffs, it was okay, but you're also incurring a lot of damage taken onto yourself, which for specific mechanics, like I mentioned, especially near the end of the instance, that can be increasingly punishing when you're having to sacrifice your own health to be able to work off of Maraud's. So having to use Light of the Martyr to hurt yourself, having low amounts of leech, even though there is an enchant and there is going to be a trinket that can give you some extra leech, you always have to gauge the cost benefit of taking that extra damage to be able to leverage out a little bit of extra throughput as a result. Maraud's, for example, looks like it will be in pretty good shape from some of the logs that I've been looking at and everything like that. But I still feel like Holy Paladin is just too much up in the air. If they started adding more Holy Power generation through like Judgment, generating Holy Power once again for H-Pallies, that might start moving in the right direction. If there might just be some straight up buffs, for example, like reversing Infusion of Light, that could be really helpful as well. But they've gone through a number of legendary nerfs and a number of nerfs to different Covenant abilities as well that just kind of pushes Paladin into some different scenario every single time. So with some buffs, they can start moving up into the S tier, but I'd say right now, I'm just not very impressed by the spec, and I don't think that Devo alone is enough to carry them. If you look at Uldir with Holy Pallies, they also had that same problem of having very low throughput, and I think in many cases, people started realizing that Holy Pally really wasn't the play on Gahoon. It was actually looking at Resto Druid, because the 2-minute trank back in Uldir was obscenely powerful, and just the fact that it had so much throughput outweighed having a bit of extra damage reduction to be able to realize for different people. So we'll see. I think a lot of people in general have just kind of like not looked too deeply into Paladin and just kind of phoned it off as saying, okay, well, like, it's gonna be good because it's Paladin every time, and then they just kind of check it off in the box. But for me, I'm not really too sure. I don't think that it's been very impressive so far, and I think it'll take some very last minute tuning for it to start moving up higher and start seeing a lot of heavy representation. But we'll see. On the B tier, both of the specs I think could perform pretty well. I would say that both Holy and Resto Druid can start making some waves in terms of just the raw throughput. The big issue with coming with Holy Priest is that they haven't really changed all that much. They haven't really grown or developed too much, and they don't have a lot of crazy, interesting synergies with their Covenant abilities at all. They've got the Kyrian that'll help give them out some extra Echoes of Light, but beyond that, really not so much. Resto Druid, on the other hand, has been a strong throughput throughout, but again, like I said, you have to make sure that you're looking at the type of throughput that it's providing and who else it could be competing with in terms of what value it's going to be bringing to the raid. So what I mean by that is, if Shaman is already going to be very strong because it brings good throughput in general, but the utility is very strong for a wide variety of fights, you look at how that healing profile is going to match up against other healers and look at the weak spots. So for example, Shaman's got decent single target healing, but a lot of times they just want to be chaining, they want to be cleave healing, for example. And that's where Mistweaver's bread and butter is just pushing Vivifies into priority targets and making sure Renewing Mist is going to be cleaving as a result. With Resto Druid, you're not having as focused of healing into a couple of targets, but they would do very well, for example, if there's a variety of targets taking priority damage. With that, I think Resto Druid could be doing pretty well, and again, Holy Priest could be doing pretty well, but they don't quite bring that overwhelming amount of utility, extra damage, for example, to be able to start pushing them into higher echelons. They don't quite synergize perfectly with what the raid is really going to be looking for throughout this. I do think that Holy Priest needs a bit of a facelift with a lot of its talents, and specifically with Holy Word interaction, not really having enough flexibility with the Holy Words on demand, being able to better suit yourself to be able to heal some of that heavy tank damage, for example, by having double Serenities instead of a second Sanctify, or instead of a Sanctify, I should say, might be very helpful. When it comes to Resto Druid, I haven't really been super blown away by the extra support that it's going to be able to have, or even just making it a more unique healer. It kind of seems like they've continued to add a lot of utility resources back to the table, but they haven't really made something that says Resto Druid is this dominant healer in this type of content. You know, you always have different DPSers who are good at single target, who are good at split cleave, but Resto Druid just, and Holy Priest for that matter as well, they just kind of heal. They just kind of heal, they're just kind of there. The overwhelming mobility of Resto Druid isn't really there anymore, and there's not really enough fights that start pressuring you into having that hyper mobile healing as well. So those different things really just start standing out as that Holy Priest and Resto Druid just seem kind of meh at the moment. And they really could go for a lot more in terms of how their talents are working, in terms of how they can make themselves more distinct and making them more valuable for a variety of content. And then once again, I must reiterate, none of these healers are going to just punish you, like if you bring it, you're bad. That's not the case at all. This is just solely my thoughts, my summary and everything like that from testing all the Mythic raid encounters, all the Heroic raid encounters, and what some of my big takeaways have been as we're getting ourselves ready for the expansion launch and to prepare what characters we think are going to be the best shape for Castle Nathria progression. So let me know what you guys think, and let me know what you guys think about that hot take from Mistweaver. I can't wait to read the comments on this one. Hope y'all enjoyed it, guys. Take it easy. I'll catch y'all next time.